This is the beginning of what the Christian church has called for centuries now, Holy Week. Now, why is it holy? Remember, we've learned this before. Something's holy because we say it is. We think it has something to do with God's activity in the world. And so during Holy Week, we remember stories that have been saved for us in the scriptures about when Jesus went back to Jerusalem. Now, we start out those stories with Sunday being the first day of the week, with Palm Sunday. Now, most of you have heard of that before, haven't you? Okay. That's why you have those palms. Now, we don't need to tell the kids this, but I need to tell the adults this. There's no sword fighting allowed with palms, okay? People get hurt, like paper cuts and stuff. But seriously, Palm Sunday. But then there's all the rest of the week, oftentimes called Passion Week. How many of you ever thought of the fact that Easter is not part of Holy Week? It's not. Holy Week ends before Easter happens. So Easter doesn't happen till next week on Sunday. That's why today we're going to remember what it means to walk down the path where the way of Christ might lead.
And when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately.'" And they went away and found a colt tied at the door out in the open street, and they untied it. And those who stood there said to them, "What are you doing untying that colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments on it, and he sat upon it. And many spread their garments on the road, and others spread leafy branches, which they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed cried out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that is coming. Hosanna in the highest." And Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
Nancy, give me just a second. This next song and the rest of the service starts the story of Passion Week. The songs have been chosen because of their words and also because of the melodies. Journey to Gethsemane is a famous tune. It's in a minor key, as are all Lenten songs in a minor key. The one in the middle is reminiscent of a Gregorian chant, "Oh, love, how deep, how flowing free." And then the last one is "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." These songs are meant for us as a way, after we hear the scriptural stories of Passion Week, to use our own voices to say a little bit about what we're feeling with a meaning behind all this. But basically, this is using these ancient stories to allow each of us to prepare for a true celebration on Easter, because we have gone to the cross, and even perhaps more importantly, to the tomb before we try to go to Easter. So in that sense, let's join together now in our Passion Week service. The Palm Sunday story. Some really, really amazing research by, everybody from archaeologists to biblical scholars to Hebrew historians. It's pretty certain now that we know which gate Jesus probably entered Jerusalem through. We know it because they've discovered the Codex of Laws that allowed certain people to go through certain gates but not other gates, and because the Passover time was coming soon in Jerusalem for the Jewish people, many of the gates you couldn't go through and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that when Jesus did this Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem that we sang about and waved the palms about, he went in to the poorest part of the city that in today's world we would probably call a ghetto. Poor people lived there. It just was not taken care of very well. The people who came out to see Jesus were probably not very many. They would not have had any way to get hold of palms. It's not like palms exactly grow everywhere in the Middle East to begin with, and they were reserved for royalty. And so some of the pictures you've probably seen in some of the movies of, the eunuchs who had those big palms waving, those may have been real, but those palms were brought from quite a ways away. So as you heard from the Gospel of Mark, which, as I hope you remember, was the first of the written Gospels. It was finished well before Matthew, Luke, and especially John, which just sort of makes it more likely to have less embellishment, less stuff added to it. It says the people had gone out into the fields and gotten, high grasses and stuff to wave and to throw down in front. So let's be honest about it. As usual, most of the people who had come to recognize Jesus as some very unusual, some very special human being, someone who was in perfect harmony with God, weren't the people in power. Let's keep that in mind, that even some of what was in the Gospel of Mark is embellished, because don't forget what was happening in the Roman Empire at that time. The law had been changed. If you were going to become a Roman citizen, and sometimes, of course, you had no choice. You had just been conquered. Either you become a Roman citizen or, you probably die. You had to not only swear allegiance to Caesar, but you had to declare Caesar is God. There had already been a deal made with the Jews that they didn't have to do that last thing. But if they didn't have to do that last thing about Caesar as God, they had to let Caesar appoint a king over the Jews who would keep them in line. They still had to swear allegiance to Caesar. Remember who the king was? Herod, appointed by Caesar. So that's what was going on at the time. Keep all that in mind. It doesn't appear that Caesar or any of the Roman rulers even noticed that Jesus had entered Jerusalem. But we find out very early on that certainly the people running the temple, the people that had the religious power and felt it perhaps threatened, they knew very well. The first reading takes place right after what we still call the Last Supper Jesus had with his disciples. We are told that they had sung a hymn, which was a very common practice then. It's a psalm that was sung. They left and went to the Mount of Olives. And then we have a reading from the 26th chapter of Matthew, verses 31 through 35. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night. For it was written in the prophet Zechariah, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. You know the story about Judas' betrayal. You've heard it many times. For some pieces of silver, he agreed to betray Jesus when they came to arrest him. It's not likely that the people who came to arrest Jesus, because they were from the guard of the religious leaders, didn't know who he was. That kind of story, again, it's sort of like a good mystery writer adds those little tales to the gospel. But Jesus was arrested that night at the gate. I'll read now from continuing in the 26th chapter of Matthew, beginning at the 47th verse. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. That was, of course, the way that all males of that time, and still to this day, greet each other. Jesus said to Judas, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. And later on, after the disciples had fled, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But Peter denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When Peter went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then Peter began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. As you can see from the bulletin, the readings we're going to now go through have to do with being accused and examined by the chief priests and the elders, and then passing on to we often call it the trial before Pilate, and then also the treatment of Jesus as a prisoner by the soldiers afterward. But there's some things to keep in mind to understand this fully. The first of which, I need to say this again, we no longer teach, nor should we ever have taught, that Jesus died to pay God off for our sins. If that really is what happened, then I encourage you not to even like that God. That was written in the Gospels to try to convince faithful Jews to join the new religion, to join the new movement following in the way of Christ. For they had practiced all their lives making sacrifices to God, showing how sorry they were for their misdoings and things, you know. That isn't why Jesus died. Jesus died because he was threatening the people in power. In fact, Jesus ends up crucified. Now, you knew that, didn't you? Didn't you? You could only even the Romans could only crucify persons for certain kinds of crimes. They weren't all really bad crimes necessarily, but they were crimes against the state or things like that. But one of the main crimes for which you could be crucified was treason. It was that the chief priests and the elders brought Jesus to Pilate and accused him of. You'll see how it works. For treason. Also notice that Pilate is no fool. Very different from most current politicians. A little editorial comment. But seriously, he's no fool. Evidently, this was a Caesar that took his job fairly seriously. And if he was going to have this guy on trial, he wanted some proof. And you can tell from the story when you hear it that Pilate doesn't want to really even have to deal with this. He wants to send it back to Herod and say, I told you not to have these Jews come and bother me now. Take care of this. But instead, for perhaps the reasons we're told in the gospel, he figures out a very smart political solution to his dilemma of condemning a man who he knows isn't guilty. And we'll hear that. And the people become complicit in it because they have been convinced by their religious leaders that they should. Now that's what this is a story about. Notice too that the majority of the soldiers treat Jesus like most prisoners, especially in those times, get treated. You will not hear in these readings a lot of respect. I'll start reading at the 57th chapter of the 26th verse of the 26th chapter. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. But they found no one, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to the high priest, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when Jesus was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to Jesus, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. This is the festival of the Passover, by the way. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For Pilate realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then Pilate asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. His blood be on you, his blood be on us and our children," said the people. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. From noon on, darkness was over the whole land until 3 p.m. About then, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." In Hebrew, that means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "The man is calling for Elijah." And one of them went and got a sponge, put on some sour wine, gave it to him to drink. But the other said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." It was usually the custom in those days that the prisoners that were going to be crucified were required to take part in erecting the crosses. Not usually, but sometimes. There is no way to know if the stories about Jesus having to drag his cross quite a ways and get it to the place of the skull, Golgotha, that's what that means, is true. In most cases, they would have reused trees or crosses that had already been there. It doesn't much matter because the way that the early believers needed to remember this, especially those who had been there, are the stories that we continue to read. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking Jesus, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to. For he did say, 'I am God's Son.'" The bandits who were crucified with Jesus also taunted him in the same way. Then, because I mistakenly read this earlier, comes the next reading. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. Joseph then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. My people, we too are sitting opposite the tomb. The service is ended. Easter will be celebrated on Sunday. Until then, think on this legacy. Please now leave this worship space in silence.